Hi guys, so today's video is going to be about some advanced fantasy series. I recently did a video about some adult fantasy that is great if you are typically a young adult fantasy reader, or if you haven't read fantasy in a while, or maybe you're a beginner to the genre. I have some recommendations, and this is essentially the opposite of that. I think that it's not really a matter of these books are so incredibly difficult and you have to be really smart to read them or anything like that, but I would not necessarily recommend these to people as their first entry into fantasy. However, if you just want to dive into the deep end, then you have a little bit more information about these books, and you can do that if you so choose. As usual, I always am comfortable talking about books even if I didn't love them myself, and that is true of the first series on this list, and that would be Malazan, Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. I read the first 2 books in the series. There are a total of 10, along with some other ones that go with it, and this is a series that a lot of people will say, the author himself will say, it's not necessarily delivered to you in a typical way, meaning most fantasy worlds, it's very obvious that it's different from our own, and the authors take great care to introducing you to this world, and they try to do it in a way that is organic. They try to do it in a way where you're not overwhelmed, and they don't want to just throw stuff at you. That's not really what this series does. You just are dropped into the middle of a very well-realized, well-fleshed out world that has so much to it, so many characters, so much with the politics, a lot to do with war, different cultures, different places. So you sometimes, from one book to the next, are being introduced to completely different characters. Magic, the rules and limitations that a lot of times we crave with adult fantasy. This one is just like, here, this person did this thing. You don't really know what's going on, and you slowly start to get bits and pieces here and there. It leaves you not really knowing what is possible within this world. You also have lots of gods, goddesses, and figures that you're wondering, wait, are these people human? Are these creatures? Who is this? And you just, that's kind of the whole experience. What's this? Who's this? Where am I? That's a lot of this series, and the fans of this, they love the challenge. It's like going for a hike, and a lot of people feel like once you get to the top, meaning once you've read the entire series, you get to fully experience everything, but a lot of people really love that ascent up the mountain as well. But for a lot of people, that ascent to get to that view is not worth it, and that's okay. It's okay. It is a big commitment. A lot of people also compare it to a puzzle where you're getting parts of the puzzle at a time, and then once you get all of it, you put it together and you see everything together, which in theory sounds so cool, but I feel toward this series the way I feel about atonal music. The concept of atonal music sounds really cool, and then I hear it and I'm like, just give me some Tchaikovsky. I want the thing that my ears like and are used to, and it's really pleasant. And even though that other thing is really unique, it's maybe not for everybody. Next on the list, we have the Stormlight Archive series by Brandon Sanderson. Each one of these books is over 1,000 pages. Most of you are probably very familiar with what the Stormlight Archive is. This one is much easier to get into as far as being introduced to concepts, to the magic. It's extremely character driven, and in a way that can actually make this one a little bit more difficult to get into than some of the other Sanderson works out there. By that, I mean, we have often with Sanderson's works a huge character focus, but with Stormlight Archive, the world is very big, and the politics, there's a lot to them. And there's a lot to the magic, there's a lot to the discovery, the rediscovery of magic, there's a lot to other cultures, and there are some other figures that are godlike or possibly gods themselves, and our characters are slowly starting to discover all of these things, and you're discovering those things alongside them, but the characters themselves and the time with the characters, it's a very slow build. Each one of the books focuses in on a single character. You get their whole backstory. But I do feel like Sanderson does kind of introduce you to everything in a way that you can digest. When you first start Stormlight, you're gonna be pretty a fish out of water. You're gonna get all these things at the beginning. So many different characters, so much is going on. You're not going to have any idea what's going on. and then you start to get it. And it's so good. The characters are they just feel so real. The mental health rep in the Stormlight Archive is also amazing. The world itself, he thinks through the flora, the fauna, the weather, the way buildings are built to accommodate the fact that they have these constant hurricane, crazy natural disasters that come through and sweep through the land. He thinks through basically everything to the point where after a while, it just feels like another country that you're learning about that actually does exist, because there's just so much to it. There's so much history, their beliefs, their customs, it's so well realized, but it takes a while. Next up, we have Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. This one, a lot of it has to do with its length. There are 14 books in this series. They're pretty long books, and it is a slightly older series, so the writing style is maybe not as accessible as you would get with something like Brandon Sanderson, although Brandon Sanderson did finish the series off. I read the first 4 books in this series. A lot of fans feel if you are going to start it, you got to read at least the first 4, because once you get to the 4th, you're not going to want to stop. I apparently am the exception, because I got to the 4th and I'm like, this solidifies that I don't want to keep going. But hopefully you will feel very different. If you do pick it up, the first one, you're probably going to want to at least read past that one. The first one, it's a little bit more tropey. It's a little bit more of what we're accustomed to, what we've seen very often. As a result, it actually makes it a little bit on the easier side when it comes to some of the books on this list. The basics of the magic are also pretty easy to understand. You have some magic that women can use, and that magic's good. And then you have some magic guys can use, and that magic is bad. And any guy that has the ability to channel eventually goes crazy and has the potential to kill lots of people on accident. But the chosen one is supposed to end up being a fella. So we're kind of stuck in this situation like, well, this could either be somebody who goes crazy and hurts a lot of people, or it could be the person to save us all. What do we do? And I really loved that setup, that dilemma. It seems generic at first, the good and bad. You have kind of ultimate evil, and then the chosen one who's supposed to save everyone. But then there's like a hierarchy of evil, and there's a lot of complexity to the magic and the world and the relationships between men and women. But the thing that makes it challenging not only is the length of the series, but you will start to get a lot of different characters. You will go to a lot of different places. Even like I said, I only read the first 4, but you start to see it as you're reading those first 4, like, oh, okay, this is gonna be a whole epic journey. There's kind of a joke within the Wheel of Time community about how many named characters there are, and on top of that, it does kind of fall into that fantasy stereotype of having a lot of really crazy names that are spelled really weird with lots of apostrophes. So even though there are elements to this that make it easy to start, it is quite the commitment if you plan on continuing. The next book on this list, I feel like in a strange way, I could have also said that this book is good for beginners, because there are different elements to this book. And that would be SENLIN Ascends by Josiah Bancroft. The thing that would make it kind of easy for some people is this has a very literary feel. If you read a lot of literary fiction, then I think this would be a great book for you to start your fantasy journey on. But if you're used to YA fantasy, or if you're somebody who reads a lot of contemporary, I don't know that this is the best one to get into. It's weird. When I did my dedicated review for it, I kind of teased myself about the amount of times that I said the book was weird. Apparently, the series just continues to get even weirder. The prose, it's very accessible, and it's quite elegant as the story progresses. I feel like the prose gets better, but a lot of it feels... My friend read it recently and felt like it was Alice in Wonderland, but for grown-ups and kind of on drugs, even more so than just Alice in Wonderland is. It's very bizarre. It follows a character who loses his wife at the Tower of Babel and then is ascending the tower. And each of the levels is different and is strange in their own way, and just so much about the story feels very metaphorical. So the reason I have it on here is because I think you have to take your time with this one, and not necessarily literally you have to read it slow, but it's not a page turner, action-packed. It's kind of a quieter book, and it's really good. But if you want to really experience the fun of fantasy. This one, it's a little more, it's both formal and weird and cheeky and not taking itself too seriously. It's a very weird book. Might not be the best one to start with, but maybe it is, depending on your tastes. Next up, we have Ninth Reign by Jen Williams. This one, I had to put it on this list because every time I go to talk about this book, which, by the way, I think is fantastic and extremely underrated, and I want way more people to read it, but every time I talk about it, it just sounds like somebody took a bunch of random concepts from a bunch of other fantasy books and then threw them all together and melted them together in a pot or made a quilt out of all these random patches of fantasy, because it's like, okay, well, here's this sort of vampire-like group of people that are also somewhat elven-like, and then here's a magic tree. They eat the sap. They eat the sap of this tree. That's how they get their abilities of immortality, basically. But then also there's like these weird abandoned sites of technology where these ghost-like spirits hang around and they can turn you inside out, basically. So it's real dangerous. And also, I guess there used to be alien invasions. I don't know, it's so weird, but every time, I'm like, man, I swear this book is good, but it sounds so weird. So much of the book is you figuring out what the heck is going on. I do think the author writes it in a way that is very engaging. I think the characters are fun. I think the story itself is a lot of fun. But if you are not used to fantasy, all these different things can be a little difficult to keep track of. So I would say go for it if it sounds cool to you, but just know you might have to take a step and be like, wait, I had to tab a part where I was like, okay, I'm tabbing this with a special certain color because I'm like, this is where it explains stuff right here, and I need to reference this occasionally because I'm probably gonna forget, and I need almost to take notes and be like, okay, so this is what these things are, this is what these people are, this is why these people don't like these people, but it's so good. Next up, we have a science fiction book. I feel like people who really like classic sci-fi are gonna be like, what? This is like the best. I would highly recommend this to everyone. And that's fine, but that would be Hyperion by Dan Simmons. It is more classic sci-fi, and I find that classic sci-fi is much more difficult for people nowadays to get into. I do think science fiction, it examines what it is to be a person and what is life. It examines those sorts of things in a way that I think is perhaps more philosophical on average than maybe what you see in fantasy. Not always, but in this one, in Hyperion, I feel like this one is delivered in an interesting way. Basically, you have a bunch of individuals who get their own story as to why they're going to a certain place, and each story is told in a format that is reminiscent of a different genre or a different means of storytelling. One of them is a bunch of journal entries. That one's really weird and kind of creepy. One of them is more like an action-adventure type sci-fi. One of them is more like a soldier's account of something. In general, all of them have a very different way of telling their own story, and they're all connected because they're all going to the same place. And if that sounds really cool to you, I would definitely pick it up, but it is a more dense writing style than I think you find with a lot of other modern science fiction and fantasy, and for that alone, it might not be the easiest one to jump into. The last one on this list, perhaps a lot of you will disagree, but that would be the First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. The reason that I think it's not the easiest one to pick up first is because it is so incredibly character-driven that if you aren't used to fantasy, I think you're going to want a little bit more explanation, a little bit more motivations from the characters to have a clearer picture of where you're going, because you're not really going anywhere. You just follow these characters around, one of which is a torturer. One of them is just such a tool bag. One of them is a chick that's introduced way later in the book that's got a lot of rage issues and wants revenge. And then the other one is this guy who's like, I'm a really bad person. I'm a northerner. And then you're like, are you a bad person? You kind of seem like a big teddy bear. And then you find out like, oh, maybe you are. I don't know. You got an interesting past here. So you just follow these characters as they're doing stuff, and they're really fun to follow. It takes a while though, because you don't know them at first. So you have to get to know these characters, and there's not, I would say, much else initially that pulls you in. So you just kind of have to wait until you're entertained by these people and you know them well enough to be curious about what's going on. And then it starts to move forward, I think, really, really well. And after that, it's a lot of fun. But it takes a while, and I think you just have to have some patience. That's it for some advanced adult science fiction and fantasy. I'm very curious, what are some books that you think are great, that you absolutely love, but wouldn't necessarily recommend to somebody who's just getting into it? If you are interested in seeing the one from before that is for newbies, feel free to jump over to that one. I'll have it linked. You can leave your recommendations for that. And if you want to see some YA books that are good for people who typically read adult fantasy, I'll have that linked as well. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.